Well, welcome everybody to our SE Online study through the book of Ruth. It's going to be 4 weeks long. That works out great because Ruth has 4 chapters. And so today we're doing session 1, Ruth chapter 1. Now, I'm assuming you've already read Ruth 1. If you haven't, go ahead and hit pause and then join the discussion after you've read that. Now, the book of Ruth opens up at a really dark time in Israel's history. We are introduced to one of our main characters, Naomi, and she leaves the land of Israel to go to Moab during a time of famine to see relief. And then, Brandon, I'm going to let you set the stage. In Moab, things don't go well for her.
No. The first 5 verses of Ruth very much compressed, like a 10-year period in Naomi's life that's just really dark.
Yeah.
That she leaves Bethlehem to go into Moab because of the famine. She leaves with her husband Elimelech, her sons Mahlon and Chilion. They settle in Moab. The sons get married there. Things seem to be going all right. And then within a very short time frame, it seems, Elimelech and the 2 sons die.
Yeah.
So it leaves Naomi with these 2 Moabite widows, along with her. Ruth and Orpah were the women that the boys had married. So we suddenly have these 3 widows kind of all by themselves.
Yeah.
And we see this very much dark time that Naomi is in, where she's lost really just about everything. She's lost her homeland, she's lost her husband, she's lost her sons. And on top of this, the very first phrase tells us this happens in the time of the judges, which is incredibly unfortunate because the period of the judges was just a time where Israel is continually falling away from God, falling into oppression and violence. And this cycle just keeps repeating and repeating and repeating. So it's very corporately dark. It's very personally dark. Things have really gone off the rails by the time we get to the end of verse 5.
And what I love about this as God unveils the story through these 4 chapters is this title, The Extraordinary Ordinary, where these are pretty ordinary things that are going to have happen as we all are going to pass through dark seasons, and we can learn a lot as we go through this book on Ruth's faithfulness, Naomi's faithfulness, and just to see the faithfulness of God intertwined with all that. So Derek, as you look through this and you were reading chapter 1, something that just stuck out to you right away, what was that?
Yeah, it's just that, if I was Naomi, kind of how tough of a spot I would really feel. I would really feel like God has kind of let me down, that, there's probably not going to be any children that are going to be coming from my family anymore of these, 2 daughters-in-law that, there's probably nothing really that's going to happen for them now. And I'm probably feel really bad. And I just think about how, man, that would be really hard to trust in God's goodness in that season.
It's easy to identify with because I know all of us are going to be faced with those seasons. So Sarah, you're reading this as well, chapter 1, first things that stuck out to you.
Gosh, I just think that they were just trying to survive. You're left in this really dark season, like Derek was talking about, and my heart just goes out to them because I can't even imagine their desperate feeling they must have felt to even consider, okay, we're going to leave this place that we've been for 10 years and try to go back. And something that kind of stuck out to me actually this morning as I was rereading it, in verse 6, it says, when Naomi heard in Moab that the Lord had come to the aid of his people by providing food for them, she and her daughters-in-law prepared to return home. So she saw that God was doing something back in Israel and wanted to be a part of it. She knew, she's like, okay, there's nothing for me here, but I want to go where God is moving and where God is going, even though it might be a worse spot for me. She had that hope propelled her, and she thought, okay, I'm just going to go where God's leading me. So that kind of really made me have a different perspective of them going back to Israel.
It's easy also, I think, to identify with us for a little bit because we all are going to pass through these seasons. And when you think about Ruth through the lens of she's a foreigner living as a foreigner in a foreign land, her 2 sons had married the foreigners in Moab, right? And so then she's only left with her only sense of family is these 2 Moabite women who really aren't her family and aren't even her people, speaking a different dialect as well, right? So this is a unique season for her to return as well. But when we think about that, before we talk to the return, when we think about the faithfulness, the faithfulness in the darkness, that is such a great allegory, Derek, of having faith in dark times.
Yeah. Yeah, I think it goes back to it's easy to trust the Lord when things are going good in our lives. It really is. That's the easiest part. To be able to say, well, of course, he is good because look at all these things that are going on in my life right now. Of course, he's great. My kids are doing well. My marriage is great. We have this house. Our cars are working. But there are times when kind of everything falls apart. And when I look at my own life, where I tend to drift the most is that, well, do I really believe that God's good? do I really believe that God's good? And I think in those seasons, that's when the enemy really wants to speak into my heart of, well, maybe he's not.
Yeah.
And what I specifically have to do is I have to literally go back to the very basics of what it looks like to have daily faith and trust him each and every day. Because if I'm trying to trust him for this whole entire season, a lot of times that's overwhelming. But when I trust him for the day, it's a lot more, it's a lot easier to tackle.
Yeah, Brandon, one of the interesting things is on Naomi's return, when she finally does return to her homeland, when she goes back to Bethlehem, she doesn't go by Naomi. She goes by the name bitter, right? She goes by Mara. Take us into that as you see the faith in the darkness. What's that look like to you?
It's interesting because you were talking about clinging to God in the midst of that. And you kind of do get the two opposite reactions in the time of suffering, because Ruth is very much loyal to Naomi and loyal to God. Like when they are turning back to Bethlehem, she has that very famous statement in 1:16 through 17 about, your God will be my God, that she is clinging to God in the midst of this. Whereas you get the opposite reaction from Naomi really is she becomes embittered and takes that name Mara, which not only means bitter, but calls back to a circumstance in Israel's earlier history where they named a place Mara because of the bitter water there. So you see how Ruth has allowed this to draw her a little bit closer into God, and Naomi, on the other hand, has taken that same circumstance and used it just to become a little bit more bitter and a little more cynical and blaming God really for what's happened in her life.
And it's fascinating too that you say that it comes from Ruth, because you would think that would be reversed, right? Because she's exhibiting the faith that you would expect an Israelite to have, right? Yes, but she doesn't. Let me read that. So from chapter 1, verse 16 and 17, it's probably the most famous passage out of Ruth that you hear quoted all the time, right? But Ruth replied, this is when Naomi was begging them not to go back with her, right? Like she's saying, don't go back to Israel with me. You guys stay in Moab. And I think it's out of empathy, thinking their life will be better with their own people as she's trying to return to her own people. But Ruth's famous response says, don't urge me to leave you or to turn back from you. Where you go, I will go, and where you stay, I will stay. Your people will be my people, and your God, my God. Where you die, I will die, and there I will be buried. May the Lord deal with me, be it ever so severely, if anything but death separates you and me. Sarah, when you see just that attitude of loyalty and faithfulness to her family, what sticks out to you about Ruth in that moment?
I think this is a really stunning verse that we use it a lot of time like in marriage ceremonies, but I think it even goes beyond that, because she is leaving behind everything she's ever known, trusting in this new God, because she even calls him Yahweh in like the original text. And so what she is doing here is saying, okay, like I have seen Naomi's faithfulness in following the Lord, and I trust this God. And I was asking Brandon, I was like, I wonder when Ruth actually like made that decision to follow God, because I mean, she's been with Naomi for 10 years and she's seen Naomi's faithfulness. And it makes me think like, people are watching us. Like you never know who is watching you. And I think it just encourages me to just be faithful, like even in those dark times, like Derek was saying. And it's like, I want someone to say, I want your God to be my God, right? Like I want people to see like my faith and say, oh, I want to follow Jesus because of this person. So I think like Naomi's faithfulness is so incredible in this moment, but also Ruth's faithfulness to her and her loyalty to follow Yahweh, even when she doesn't really know what's going to happen when they get to Israel.
Brandon, I want you to return for a second back to the name of this entire study and kind of zoom us back to that. The extraordinary ordinary. Talk a little bit about that through the lens of chapter 1.
Okay. Well, it's interesting because Ruth is a very plain book, right? Like there are no miracles in it. There's nothing that, no parting of the Red Sea or no dry bones coming to life or anything like that. It is something that takes place in the ebb and flow of everyday life. And the book of Ruth is many things that kind of set it apart. One, it's kind of a history story. It gets us from the end of the time of Judges to the beginning of Samuel and the beginning of the monarchy. So it fills in a gap there. It's also interesting because it's a love story in the Old Testament. It tells the story of Ruth and Boaz, which is kind of, it fits, it would make a good like chick flick. It'd be great. We should cast it now. But But most importantly, it's an everyday story.
Yeah.
Like it is something where, people just are going about their day-to-day lives. There's harvest time. There's going out in the fields and gathering crops. There are conversations. Like 55 of the 85 verses in Ruth contain some sort of conversation between people. So it is a book of just the decisions that you make every day and how those everyday ordinary decisions compound into something extraordinary. And I think we see that here is that the everyday faithfulness of Ruth just compounded on that day where she stood in the field and Naomi's trying to push her away. Like the word in Hebrew is like she's physically trying to push Ruth away. And Ruth is like, no, don't push me away. But her loyalty compounds to on that day where she makes this extraordinary decision to leave her homeland and go follow Naomi back into Bethlehem and to follow the God of Israel.
I like this idea too of ending on the word commitment with this week of that's what we really see is just a committed faithfulness. And the idea of the extraordinary ordinary is that when we live such committed lives, it changes so much about it in the ordinary. When you hold to your word and you stick to it, Derek, like I know there's nothing that sticks out more. Like I was thinking about what would change in the world if just moms and dads lived like that, took the vows that they took very seriously and were committed to their children and were committed to God. What would change in the world if all of our commitments look like that? So Derek, I'll give you the last word a little bit. This, like, as you think through just the simple faithfulness in everyday life, this book illustrates it really well. What would be your last word to us?
Yeah, I think this entire relationship that we see in chapter 1 is that things are never easy, right? Things are always messy. Things never go the way we think they're going to go. And if we're willing to cling to the Lord and stick to our commitment to people, then we're going to ride through it. But it's not going to be by ourselves. It's going to be with other people and with the Lord.
Yeah, there's nothing in this world, to end on this thought, there is nothing more beautiful, I think, than someone that lives a very committed life. It just stands in contrast because the rest of the world does not do that.